Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to talk this afternoon about how I came to this book, or how the book came to me, which in some ways was a simultaneous event, or how a Connecticut Yankee with a 25-year career in journalism and several failed attempts at fiction suddenly decides that he wants to be a historian, but not only that, but that he wants to write about Comanches and the Great Plains, which are about as far from Connecticut as the frozen moons of Jupiter. I won't bore you with all the sordid details of my literary past, but to put it as briefly as possible, I had my little epiphany in the spring of 1970. I had just been admitted to Princeton University, and I was traveling there for a weekend, one of those weekends, you know, where you see if you want to go there. And it was a glorious day in May, just absolutely, kind of like this morning here, actually, and spring was in full bloom. And I had taken a train, and the last leg of this train trip was on a little, very much smaller train called the PPJ&B, which stands for Princeton to Princeton Junction and back. And that took you right onto the campus. And on the trip, I happened to be reading a book by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it was his first one, called This Side of Paradise, and the one that made him famous. It was all about life at Princeton. And it was an absolutely magical book to me. I mean, I can't even read 2 paragraphs of that book now. It's so adolescent. But at the time, it was absolutely magical. And I finished it. I happened to finish it just as the train was pulling into the little station. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to Princeton. It's cute as a button. I was finishing it just as the train pulled in. And I walked out, and I walked up onto the campus, and I walked by 12 University Place, which is where Fitzgerald had lived, and which is what I just read about, and onto the campus. And I remember thinking at that moment that there was absolutely nothing in the world that I would rather do than to be able to write like Scott Fitzgerald. Period. Well, it was all downhill from there. For the next 15 years or so, I wrote a bunch of fiction, published some of it, got a graduate fellowship at Johns Hopkins under John Barth. But none of what I did was much good, unfortunately. It wasn't great stuff. I worked, I had jobs, you know, I was a French teacher, and I was a banker, but all the while I persisted in seeing myself as a writer. And I would go home at night and I would, read Gertrude Stein, and whatever writers were supposed to do, I did that, or Henry James, or Thomas Pynchon, or whatever I was doing. And I was aware on some level as time went by that, I wasn't exactly, like Scott and Zelda, living in Paris and sipping champagne from ladies' slippers and, eating oysters at the Ritz. I mean, I was aware of that wasn't happening for me. Anyway, at some point it occurred to me that I actually could make a living by writing, and so I became a reporter. In my early 30s, I started to do that, and as I got better and better at nonfiction, the fiction dream kind of slowly went away. And it's interesting now because for me, in my age now, everything's black and white. It's this or that. I mean, I think it's hard even for me to understand myself at a younger age where things weren't so absolute, where you could be an international banker and a writer, or think you were going to be that at the same time. But anyway, as I got, the fiction dream kind of went away, and then went away in one giant, glorious, spectacular, cataclysm, which was a 700-word novel called Morning's Ark by S.C. Gwynne, whose main effect was to cause my agent in New York not to return my phone calls. And then it was gone, and really it was a cathartic experience. This didn't happen that long ago, and it had to be done. You had to realize, we all have to realize what we can't do, and that's something that I can't do. And I don't look back and I don't regret it. I'm not like a failed novelist. I am a failed novelist, but I don't think of myself as a failed novelist. I don't care. I don't even read fiction that much anymore. It doesn't really matter to me. But here's the difference. The difference for me is that it comes down to the kind of the legendary blank page, that the writer sees. The blank page is, for a fiction writer, absolutely astonishing thing. On that blank page, you can put there are no rules at all. You could be about Iran, or Mars, or New Jersey. It could be about an old man, or a dog, or a bumblebee, or a Martian, or it could be about anything. It could be about death, or marriage, or life, or birth. There are no rules. And so me looking at the blank page, I don't know, I have no idea. What am I supposed to do? What am I going to put there? I don't know. And the difference is with nonfiction, this applies to my journalism as well as my history, it's something palpable and real. It's something very real that you hang on to, and you start with the premise of the real. And that is my preamble. And thus I ended up in Austin, Texas, as executive editor of a wonderful magazine called Texas Monthly, and essentially learning what I know how to do now between the years 2000 onward. And it was there in Texas where all this Comanche nonsense started. When I told my journalist friends a few years ago that I was writing a history of the Comanches, I mainly got a lot of blank stares. And you could see that the little wheels turning in their tiny little news-driven brains, you know, trying to figure out what the angle was. It was like, well, is there some kind of Indian Nations, Bureau of Indian Affairs, like healthcare Obama, some angle that should be? And I say, no. This is just dusty old history of stuff that happened 300 years ago. And they would just look at me and go, "Oh, Sam, that's great. That's gee, we can't wait to read it." Meaning, good luck, Jack. Or as one of them later said, you know, "Sam, you really think anybody's going to be interested in the Comanches?" And I said, no. And, you know, frankly, I didn't care. I wanted to do it, and I think we all should do things that we want to do. And it's nice if they sell. But the fact is that a lot of us in this profession write books, but very few of us are interested in jumping a long way back into history. And that's partly because reporters, and I don't want to run them down too badly here, but they have the attention span of a gnat, for one thing. And it's partly because of obvious lack of qualifications. I mean, my qualifications were writing a C+ thesis in the history department on the Paris Commune of 1871, in case you're interested. It's there at the library, Paris Commune of 1871. Although, you know, what I hear, and this is actually great, you know, you can check your thesis out of Princeton Firestone Library, which is great. And so what my plan is to do, which I haven't executed yet, is to go check it out of the library, take it somewhere, and burn it. but I haven't done that yet. And anyway, you know, I'm just not this guy. I'm not a historian. I wasn't sitting at Oklahoma University or University of Georgia for 30 years, you know, mulling over Native American history. So why does a reporter of the present become interested in something that happened in the faraway past? And what got me interested in the first place was something I will call generational memory, and I'll explain that in a minute. I grew up in Connecticut and Massachusetts, parts of the country where Native American tribes had been subdued a very long time ago. We're talking about the 1600s. And though I was aware of, say, the Mashpee Indians on Cape Cod, for example, and I even played summer baseball with a few of them, they had ceased to exist as a free tribe 100 years before my ancestors ever got off the boat in Boston. And if no one really knew anything about, you know, Algonquins or Mohegans or Pequots or Narragansetts, it was because simply too much time had intervened for anyone to have any conceivable generational memory of them. The frontier, if you will, was not part of my upbringing. But in Texas, where I moved as Time magazine's bureau chief in 1994, this whole sense of the frontier and of Native Americans was radically different. And in fact, I never in a million years would have written this book. I never would have gone near this book if I had not moved to Texas. One of those strange and fortuitous circumstances that happens to you when you simply move around. In Texas, it was part of my job to travel the state and write stories, first for Time magazine and then for Texas Monthly. And in this travels, I just met all sorts of people who told me about Comanches. You know, the woman who sat next to me at Texas Monthly, Keita McMath, both of her great-grandparents had been killed in a Comanche raid. I mean, I knew my great-grandparents. I met someone whose grandfather, not great-grandfather, had done business with Quanah Parker. There was a sense of the immediacy of the frontier. And often in my travels, you know, and sometimes, you know, it was this weird mixing of legend and history. I remember one night, and this is a classic way that I got interested in Comanche. So I'm up in the little town of Nocona near Wichita Falls in North Texas. It's actually a Comanche word named after Comanche. So I'm up there, and I'm doing a story about the Nocona, if any of you know baseball gloves or softball gloves, Nocona makes these great gloves. Anyway, the factory had burned down, and the little town was struggling. So I'd gone up, you know, to do my Nocona story. And I was sitting in a bar with some old guy, and he was telling me about this battle that took place right out there by Ringgold. You can just see it right out there. He told me about the battle where the Spanish and Comanches and Kiowas. I don't know what he's talking about. No idea. As it turns out, what he was talking